Trade talks are intensifying around the Minnesota Wild as multiple outlets indicate that the Wild are the likely landing spot for Vancouver Canucks forward Brock Boeser. And with the future in the Wild's top six, including Kirill Kaprizov's future at the moment uncertain, adding a guy like Brock Boeser, even with Kaprizov staying, adds a huge dynamic to the top six, including goal scoring and a lot more. We'll be diving into the exact reports, what they've been saying, and how this impacts the Wild at this deadline and for the future, all coming up on this episode, so you won't want to miss it. But before we get into the episode, hit the free subscribe button down below. You want daily content covering your favorite NHL team? Well, this is the spot to be. So leave a subscribe down below. Hey, it's worth it, I promise. Let's get right into the video, Mark, and I want to start with the report from Dave Pagnotta of the fourth period. Now, the fourth period, they post all of their top trade targets, and Brock Boeser there is number 14 on their list. We'll link this down below. And the number one team that you see there linked is the Minnesota Wild. And they go on to say that the Canucks and Boeser, well, they're not close to an extension. Vancouver wants midterm, Boeser wants long-term, and there's a report out there saying he wants about 8 years, $8 million. And the Minnesota Wild, well, first of all, they're a natural fit because, of course, Boeser is from nearby, but also the Minnesota Wild have been after him for a while. And per Michael Russo, Bill Guerin hoped to make a trade work when Brock Boeser was first placed on the block back in 22-23, but he couldn't do it because of the cap situation. Mark, looking at Boeser's stats this season, I mean, look, they're not insanely impressive compared to what he's done before, but still 18 goals, 35 points in 50 games is nothing to scoff at. What do you think about Boeser to the Minnesota Wild, and how would this impact this team today?
I mean, the biggest thing is looking at the Wild. I think adding another elite goal scorer. I mean, Brock Boeser just scored 40 goals last season. He's a clutch player in the playoffs. Brock brings everything you need in an elite goal scorer to this Wild team. And I think it really helps fill out the top six, not only this year, if they can extend them on a 7-year deal. This would be the perfect guy to fill it. I know Minnesota fans, they want to win in the playoffs. Looking at Brock this year, or last year, I should say, with the Vancouver Canucks, we've seen him go into the playoffs, firing at a point per game, scoring a hat trick to win them a game against the Nashville Predators in the playoffs. This guy is a playoff performer, someone that can score you 20 plus goals. And like I said, 40 last season, he has it in him. The Canucks are struggling, so I don't really look at his 18 goals, 35 points as a drop off, and more of a hey, the team around him is struggling. He's not getting the playmaking that he was getting last year. This will improve, especially if he went next to guys like Rossi, even Kaprizov. These guys will help him out tremendously. I mean, looking at him, Josh, would you put him in that top six immediately and think maybe he can get back to this 40 goal scoring pace?
I mean, if you didn't put him in the top six immediately, I think you'd be doing him a huge disservice. Like right now, look, I know Kaprizov is injured, and I suppose I said in the intro the future is uncertain with Kaprizov, but by all accounts, the Wild are going to do everything they can to sign him long term. Like, look, we want him to stay around. Bill Guerin said, hey, I want him to stay around. They'll send him all the money in the world, but I think you make a great point. Playing with a playmaker like Kirill Kaprizov and a goal scorer like Kirill Kaprizov is going to do nothing but help Brock Boeser. And one thing that Boeser actually does bring is not only that, Minnesota-ness, a Burnsville, Minnesota native, but it's a right-hand shot in the top six. And as of today, now the lineups we're showing you were just as of February 24th. By the way, one day before Boeser's birthday on the 25th. Maybe you're watching this on his 28th birthday. Who knows? But right now, Brock Boeser would bring that right-hand shot to the top six that's severely lacking, honestly, because Zuccarello, Rossi, Boldy, Johansson, Eriksson Ek, and Kaprizov, those are all left-hand shots. There's a few right-hand shots on the team right now. But bringing that right-hand shot goal scoring, I know it seems like just a little thing, but it brings another level of dynamic play, not only in 5-on-5, but especially on the Minnesota Wild power play. Just another weapon. Say he can fire it from the left side or from the slot like we often see him do. Like, it brings another level of dynamic to this team. So, Mark, I ask you then, like, if we look at this roster with Brock Boeser in it, even if it's just for this season, and you assume Kaprizov comes back, you have to look at that top six and say that is one of the better top sixes in the playoff picture this year. Now, again, there's a lot of supporting stuff that needs to go right, but as the defense is getting healthy again with Faber and Middleton and Brodin and Spurgeon, and if Kaprizov comes back in time for the playoffs, whatever happens with his injury, and you insert Boeser there, this team looks legitimately, well, I mean, they're already dangerous, but even more dangerous than we thought before.
Because, I mean, the biggest thing, adding Boeser, he would be what? Top six in scoring on this team. Looking at Boeser in that top six, you can bump some guys down, which does make the middle six and bottom six even better. But getting that pure goal scorer in that top six, I think takes some pressure off guys like Boldy, Kaprizov. They can get more room to work because you can't leave a guy like Brock Boeser open anywhere. I'm not saying he's going to go out and be Ovi and have his zone where no one's going to leave him, but this guy's going to go out, pot you 30 plus goals at each year if you can get him extended. I think it would open up a lot of opportunities for other guys to even take a bigger step where they have more open ice. People have to cover Brock, especially on the power play. That
Mhm.
guy's going to be lethal. And once the playoffs hit, this is the type of guy I think Minnesota desperately needs. And I'm not saying they're not going to win without him, because I do think the Minnesota Wild are contenders and are going to go deep. But I think Brock could be the tipping point to put them as favorites.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible. I mean, favorites is, I mean, I guess it's hard to say because there's so many good teams around the league right now. And look, our division rival, the Winnipeg Jets, is like, it's tough to beat Connor Hellebuck, but still, we have all this talk about Brock Boeser, and as much as I agree that he's a good fit, the problem is, how do you make this work money wise? Now, the Minnesota Wild have 8.2 million in deadline space, but like that on its own is enough to absorb Besser's contract, his full contract. But the problem is Kaprizov's on LTIR, so if Kaprizov's not on LTIR, you have to make a lot of things work kind of financially to bring in a guy like Brock Boeser. And a lot of people are speculating that Vancouver would have to retain, or they'd have to find a third party to retain, which would just make this deal even more complicated. And that team would get some draft compensation, probably likely from the Minnesota Wild in a deal like that. So, I mean, looking at the roster, looking at the cap space, and looking at what Vancouver is reported to want, and that's, younger players, but who have been in the league for a bit, maybe we're talking early, mid-20s guys, there's not many that the Minnesota Wild could offer up that would equate to the value of a Brock Boeser. But then again, it really depends on if you think the Canucks are saying, look, we just got to cut our losses, get whatever we can for him, and like they did in the JT Miller trade, get some draft picks, get some assets, and flip them again immediately. The Wild don't have a first or third this year. Of course, the Eriksson Ek trade got rid of some draft picks. Mark, if Minnesota's to make this kind of trade, I mean, I assume Vancouver's probably going to be calling on Marco Rossi, and I would hang up the phone immediately if I was Bill Guerin. But like, I don't know. When it comes to the money, I find that very difficult to do. You're probably going to have to part with, I mean, I don't know, maybe someone like a Trennan, but that's not really going to move the needle. Maybe someone like a Liam Ogren, as much as I like him, 23 points in 25 games in the AHL this year. This is going to be tough to pull off. It's possible, but I think this hurdle, it's scaring me. It's the one thing that scares me the most about this trade probably not ending up happening, because it's just so complicated in that nature.
I mean, looking at this, we know the Minnesota Wild have one of the best prospect pools in the entire National Hockey League. And like you said, when JT Miller was traded, they got some pieces back, but they also got a first round pick that they immediately flipped to Pittsburgh to add more depth in Marcus Pettersson, Drew O'Connor, and other pieces. So I could see Patrick Allvin saying, hey, you guys have a deep prospect pool. We know they're selling teams around the National Hockey League. Why don't we move on for Brock Boeser? You give us draft capital, maybe prospects. We'll flip that immediately for the needs we actually have. It kind of helps out all three teams, and not even having to be a three-team trade, but you're able to get what you need from the Canucks side. The Wild get Brock Boeser.
Mhm.
The third team gets what they need, and it kind of helps everyone out. And looking at this, I do think it is possible. Obviously, the cap's going to be a big situation, the extension, but we know Patrick Allvin has made it very clear he doesn't want to lose his own players for nothing in the offseason. So, kind of throwing it back to you, Josh, would you move out maybe one of the many prospects the Wild have and a pick to bring him in, even if he's a rental?
Depends on the prospect, depends on the pick, but in theory, yeah. Like, well, if he's just a rental, I wouldn't be so sure. I think if you're Minnesota and you're doing that, you're ready to give him about what he's asked for, and that is reportedly around 8 years, $8 million. I'd be a bit more comfortable with a slightly lower cap hit based on his injury history. Like, the dude doesn't play a ton of games every year, though he did play 81 last year, and he's played 50 this year. His history before that is not super, super great. So, there's reasons to not give him the 8x8, right? But also with the cap rising and Minnesota not having that much money tied up longer term, as you can see here, it's like you can probably swallow it right now. And Minnesota only has 16 out of their 23 roster spots filled for next year, 21 million cap space coming up next year. And after next year, you're going to have the Kaprizov extension. So my final question to you, Mark, is if you're Minnesota, are you comfortable giving Boeser 8x8? That's the number that I think is going to stick in this deal, and whether Minnesota probably pursues this or not. If they internally think that we can sign him for that 8x8? Or do you think that's just too much for a guy like Brock Boeser at this stage?
I think the biggest thing is, yes, the term. I think the money is perfect for a guy
Mhm.
that can go out, score you 40 goals, be a playoff performer. But the term is the biggest thing. Like you said, looking at his stats, this is a guy that has missed some time. He missed the playoffs last year. We've seen him dominate in the first 12 games, going down with an injury versus the Edmonton Oilers. So I do think the term would be a little tricky. But if any team he's going to is going to be a team that he'll give a team friendly discount to,
Mhm.
would be his hometown team with the Minnesota Wild. So I think there is a possibility if he went to Minnesota, the culture he loves, which I'm sure he would, he grows with the team, he sees what this team can prove. I could see him taking a cheaper contract than any other team around the league. So the term, yes, is a bit tricky. If you can get him maybe on a 4 or 5 year deal at 8, 8.5, I would kind of lean towards doing this, especially if you want to make moves to free up more cap space once Kaprizov comes, the Ryan Suter and Parise is off. So you don't have to worry about that anymore. But looking at that, Josh, would you give him the 8 years?
Again, that's my sticking point. Personally, it scares me a bit, but if the cap hits right, the cap hits right. 8x8 is, again, like I said, I'd prefer it between 7 and 8, but I don't think Boeser would go for that. So there's a lot of things here, and again, not to mention his defensive game really isn't that great. But hey, Minnesota has a great defense behind him. Like you got looking at their core moving forward, like you got guys like Middleton, you got guys like Faber, even Brody and Spurgeon. So you can make up for what Boeser lacks in certain areas of his game, which is why I think he'd be a great fit. But we want to hear from you guys. Would you give him that contract if he was able to come to our Minnesota Wild? And would you even trade for him, considering he might just be another little rental? Like, we don't even know what's going on with the Rantanen situation. Could this be something else like that? I think he'd be a great fit. It depends on the price, but I think for the right price, Billy G might just be onto something here. But that'll do it for this episode. If you enjoyed, leave a like, comment, and subscribe to the channel down below. It's completely free, and you won't regret it. I promise. I'm Josh Gosse, my co-host, Mark Pye. We'll catch you in the next one.